Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
Once upon a time, Wilmington stood among the centers of jazz music in this country. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. The story of this vibrant community is recounted in a new book entitled Boysie's Horn, The History of Jazz in Wilmington in the 20th Century. The author is Stephen Leech, who traces not only the musicians and the cultural vibrance of the community, but also the decline brought on by racism and economic forces that led to its demise. And we have him on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
So tell me then a little bit about this African-American community that grows up on the east side of Wilmington. And I understand it's sort of in part the result of the Great Migration from the South.
Yes, of course, that's all part of it. It goes back further than that. And there were a number of elements that did feed into the community, especially from the late 19th century as well as the Great Migration. So it's a mix of cultures, as I've found out, and there's some very old families that are on the east side, which was basically the home of the black community in Wilmington for many, many years.
And in terms of the character of this community, how would you describe it, particularly as it begins to move into this era of jazz?
Well, I find that it was very resourceful. There were a number of social organizations, particularly Howard High School and the Walnut Street YMCA, which were basically centers of culture in the community. Howard High School, having had Alice Dunbar Nelson as one of their teachers at one time, also produced a lot of remarkable people like the Redding brothers, Jay Saunders and Lewis Redding, as well as a number of great musicians, and that's where we want to go there. Yeah, going back to the early 20th century.
Okay, so you say that it was really one of the centers that you compare it to, like the New Orleans, Kansas City, New York, Chicago. Was it really up to that speed? Because when we think about Wilmington, we obviously think about a much smaller town.
Yeah, well, it was probably the smallest among the list that you provided. But it did have a lot of great talent here. And a lot of those artists did go on to play with other musicians. As a matter of fact, one of the earliest bands in Wilmington was the Paul Thompson Dixieland Band, which was pre-World War I or around the same time. And one of the musicians there, went ahead and reputedly played with Mamie Smith, who was one of the early jazz artists in the country. So he had to be good, and that was Clarence Shepard, who went with Mamie Smith.
And you talk, by the way, about a sort of Harlem Renaissance influence in what was going on in the town. Tell me a little how that spills into Wilmington.
Right. Well, music was just one component of the general cultural movement in Wilmington in the early 20th century. I did mention Alice Dunbar Nelson, who was a teacher at Howard High School. She was married for a time to Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was a great poet around the turn of the century. She herself did a lot of writing and criticism, poetry, and social activism as well, and became quite well known in the city and fed a lot of good things that way. And of course, the Redding brothers. We know about Lewis B. Redding and his role in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case, but his brother, Jay Saunders, was a literary critic at some of the best universities in the country. He's an expert in the field of literature. He disdained the idea of black literature because he favored American literature, and he knew that people like Richard Wright had contributed a lot to the idiom. And that comes from Wilmington. Those are people who grew up here. So all of that fed each other, the music and the literature and the art We had great artists like Edward Loper, for example, is probably the shining example. All that came out of the city of Wilmington on the east side in the 20s and the 30s. And it was really quite a vibrant neighborhood. There were a lot of businesses there that flourished, black-owned businesses that kept every kind of commerce, I believe, from stores to gas stations to restaurants. There was even a newspaper, a broad newspaper, like the Delaware State News or whatever it is that you have. It came out twice a week, and it was a great contributor to the cultural day-to-day life in the city of Wilmington. Quite a place, quite a toddling town.
Wait, by the way, in terms of, obviously we're talking about a period of Jim Crow, how did that influence where the community was and how people interacted? Because obviously on the one hand you had a fairly vibrant African-American community with, as you say, lots of artists and musicians and so on and so forth. On the other hand, they were sitting there in the midst of segregation.
Yeah, it's quite a contradiction. I mean, Delaware having been a border state, slave in the lower counties and free in the upper counties, more or less, was a different kind of city. And the city of Wilmington was kind of, divided up among people with different backgrounds. And the old Southern ethos sort of seeped in and kept Jim Crow alive in Delaware for, way past its due. But you have to remember that Wilmington, had the whipping post, in the early 20th century. And it had a lot of backward kinds of policies. And one of them was Jim Crow. And on the west side, and in other places, it was still, separate drinking fountains, that kind of thing. Accommodations weren't really settled in Wilmington until the early 60s with the case with Dutch Burton, who was a Wilmington city councilman who was refused service in a restaurant on the west side. Now, I should say that on the east side, anybody could come into any of those clubs. They were open to all people. And if there was segregation on the east side, it was de facto. I know it was completely open. As a matter of fact, one of the clubs that opened in the post-war era was completely integrated. That was the whole policy of the place, and that was the Sans Souci on French Street, sort of the Cafe Society of Wilmington. So, in a sense, the cultural atmosphere, the music, at least had the potential of breaking down, these separations among people.
Before we get into some of the individual musicians, what was the club life like, and what kinds of clubs were there, and what were they like? I mean, can you give some sense about what they were like if you had gone into one of these?
Well, I'll give you two examples that I kind of know about. One was the Club Baby Grand in the post-war era. Before that, it was the Club Harlem on 9th Street at Poplar Street, which has been renamed Clifford Brown Walk. And it was the most popular. It was a small place. It was always, tight inside, crowded. It had a great vibe, and maybe a little bit funky, Another one that I can tell you about is the Spot, which was at 703 French Street. And it was a little bit more classy, more chrome, a lot of art on the walls, and by that I mean graphic art. That would be, a little bit like wallpaper, I guess, but interesting to look at. And it people tended to bring. It was a little more classier, but not necessarily. That was it was another spot. There were a lot of other spots I can't tell you anything about except that they were there.
Sure.
In the 30s.
So let me turn to Clifford Brown, because he's one of the most prominent people in the in your book. Obviously, he dies suddenly. Tell me then a little bit about his background and what his kind of contribution he made to the jazz era.
Well, Clifford Brown was amazingly talented, and some say he was a genius. He was from a large family on the East Side. His house is the only one on the block that's not there, which is there's something telling about that. And he came from a large family. I think he was the youngest of all his siblings. They were a musical family. He got interested in music by playing with his father's musical instruments. And he caught on. He had a couple of great teachers. When he was in high school, Sam Wooding was one of his teachers, and Sam Wooding is a whole different story there, but he had a great influence on Clifford Brown, as did Boysie Lowry, who was also subsidizing his music with teaching, and he had a great influence on Clifford Brown. And Clifford Brown he practiced a lot. Let's put it that way. There was a time when he was laid up because of an automobile accident, and he really got good because that's about all he did is practice the horn and the piano. And he caught on, when Dizzy Gillespie heard him. Dizzy Gillespie came to Wilmington, and I should supplement my remarks by saying Wilmington also attracted a lot of great musicians from the outside. And so Dizzy came to town and needed a trumpet player real quick because his regular trumpet player, or other trumpet player, I should say, didn't show up. But when Dizzy heard Clifford Brown play, well, that was it. Word got out. And Brownie began to get gigs until 1952, when he made a recording, which was not jazz. It was with Chris Powell and the Blue Flames, and it was an R&B number. But once that began, Clifford Brown was in demand on both coasts. He recorded in California, which is where he met his wife, LaRue, and also gigged all over the place, even in Canada, while recording, with top shelf musicians. And if you listen to him, you've got to be amazed. Charlie Parker was amazed at one point, I understand. So that gives you some idea of Clifford Brown's prowess on his instrument.
He seemed to, as you indicate, to mentor a lot. And one of the things that, of course, happens is that he struck down early, I guess, in his life. I think it was 1956. He suddenly died. Tell me a little bit about the impact, because, as you indicate in your book, the community really reacted to that sudden death.
It was traumatic. I mean, the east side of Wilmington was close-knit. Everybody knew everybody, especially, and there were big families. So there was a lot of interaction, a lot of bonding among groups of all ages. Plus, he was talented. I mean, the guy was a genius. I mean, people here knew it because they heard him play, as he grew up. And it was a terrific impact. I don't know how better I can describe it.
You also, by the way, I want to talk about Robert Boysie Lowry, the name of the book. Mm-hmm. What was he like, and what did he contribute to this community, particularly in terms of music and the musicians that obviously came after?
Boysie Lowry was a wise man. I got to talk to him a couple of times, and he was a gentle soul. Spoke in parables sometimes. Always a bit of a trickster, but always good-hearted and a great conversationalist, and someone who loved the music and really appreciated those who could play it well. And if you didn't play it well, he would make sure that you could at some point. He was one of those kinds of guys.
And is he played saxophone? Is that right?
Saxophone, yes. As a matter of fact, I know where his saxophone is right now.
Where is it?
It's with a mutual friend that he left it to. Actually, I do mention him in the book, Maurice. Maurice has his saxophone.
Okay. Any thought that they'd be put on display later on, or does
Well,
anybody know? Yeah.
there may be a line of custody issue,
Ah.
because it was an informal gift.
Okay. I want to also turn to Lin Winchester, his
Right.
vibronist. And you write in the book, you say that Lem Winchester could wiggle his ears. He'd press his face up against a window, making
Yeah.
it broad and distorted, then wiggle
Right.
his ears. It never failed to elicit a belly laugh. It sounds
Yeah.
like he was a very amusing guy.
He was, as Maurice, as I refer to him again. Maurice, the two of them grew up together, so they knew each other very well. But Maurice said that Lem was the smartest man he ever knew, and it sounds like he probably was. He was an amazing musician and character. Yeah, put it that way.
So tell me then a little bit about his contribution to this musical scene.
Well, Lem played the vibraphone. It wasn't his first instrument. He was also part of the Howard High School band, probably around the same time that Sam Wooding was there, but maybe maybe in his last year. He began with the piccolo, and then he went to the flute, and then he went to the saxophone. But he discovered a way of playing the piano like Lionel Hampton did with one finger. And then he realized, wait a minute, there is this other instrument called the vibraphone. And so he really kind of concentrated on the vibraphone after learning a lot of other instruments. And practiced an awful lot.
Right.
And became pretty well known basically from a recording that was made at Newport. He was invited to play at the Newport Jazz Festival by Leonard Feather, who was an impresario and musician and composer in his own right. When he got a tape of a group of Wilmington musicians with Lem Winchester, and when he heard the tape, he invited Lem Winchester to the Newport Jazz Festival in 1958. And from there, again, almost like the Clifford Brown example, when his peers heard him, they were pretty well amazed, And Lem got a number of recording gigs with top-shelf musicians. And all this time, he kept his day job because he was in Wilmington. His band was in Wilmington, and he was a Wilmington police officer. So he did both for a long time until push came to shove, and he had to make a decision. And that's when he became professional. He retired from the police department, and on his first professional gig, he died. Another tragic ending to a promising career.
Tell me then a little bit about that happened, because his fascination with guns was obviously involved.
Yeah, he was a police officer, as I said, and back in those days they carried those old 38 caliber revolvers. And that's important in this case, because Lem used to play this trick with his revolver, where he'd take all the bullets out and spin the cylinder on the revolver, point the gun at his head, and pull the trigger. And of course, every time he did it, the revolver would go click. That's because he knew where that round was all the time. Because what he would do is listen for the clicks in the ratchet in the cylinder, and that way he knew where that bullet was. And he would scare people with the trick. I mean, I knew someone. I knew a couple people who actually saw him do it, and one person said it really scared the expletive out of him.
Right.
And he was at his first professional gig. It was a band that was made up of all Wilmington musicians, including Gerald Price, who also, played with some of the bigwigs, and and Papa D. Allen, who went on to play with War, Eric Burden's band out on the West Coast. They were all in his band, and they went out to this place in Indianapolis, Indiana, and they did their first set. But from what I understand, their piano player, Gerald Price, had a toothache, so Lem went over to the bar and asked the bartender if he had any aspirin. And he noticed that the bartender kept a pistol underneath the bar. So Lem, said, "Well, let me show you a trick." And he did this trick. And at that point, when he put the pistol to his head, it blew a hole through his head, and that's how he died. And the reason that happened was that the pistol that the bartender had was not a Colt; it was a Smith & Wesson. And on a Smith & Wesson, the cylinder revolves in the opposite direction.
Mm.
So he miscalculated, and that's how that happened. Just as he was turning officially professional. And it's a shame, because if he were to be recording after that, he might be recording with his band from Wilmington, because they were all great musicians, every single one of them. As attested by the fact that Papa D went out and had a career, and Gerald Price, he recorded with people like Sonny Stitt and Richie Cole and others. So that's what happened to Lem Winchester, and you have to wonder, if those guys had lived, what kind of jazz scene we would have here.
And the other thing that you mentioned is that there's a number of incidents. I think you alluded to one, which was, I think, with Dutch Burton being refused. But also there was an incident with Joe Pine, and I don't have the name of the musician in front of me, who was refused a drink. Tell me a little bit about that, because Joe Pine, when I think about Joe Pine, he was sort of this right-wing conservative guy. But there was this incident where he stood up.
Yeah, he did. Joe Pine, I'm not sure where he was coming from, when he was in Wilmington, he was just abrasive, but the political atmosphere in the 50s could probably disguise a lot of real bigotry, because it was all around anyway,
Right.
So the person who he was with was Ralph Morris. Ralph Morris was a musician. He also was a friend of Clifford Brown's. And also his brother, his oldest brother, Peck Mars, had one of the first jazz bands here in Wilmington in the 20s. And I knew Ralph, a little bit later than that. I met Ralph in the mid-'70s and became friends for the entirety of his life. And I'm friends with his entire family. And he was being on the program with Joe Pine. Under what capacity, I'm not sure, because Ralph wore many hats. But anyway, he was here, and this is a story that Ralph told me, that they were in a restaurant in Wilmington, and Ralph was refused a drink, And Joe Pine said, "Look, you're going to have to give my guest a drink, or I'm leaving," basically. And that's the long and short of the story. But that's also an illustration, again, of the Jim Crow that was going on in Wilmington, when Pine was here. And he was here in the late 50s, basically, left in the early 60s.
Now, you recount in your book, of course, that we get to what's called urban renewal. And tell me then a little bit about the impact, obviously, on the landscape that took place, that obviously lots of homes were destroyed to make room for other things, and the impact that it had then on the African-American community and the jazz scene itself there.
Yeah, very much so. The east side at one point looked like a desert. It was, just barren ground, and he just took everything out. I mean, even some icons, like the Mother AME Church, which was, I may not get the initials right, but it was the church that Peter Spencer built, and he's one of the pioneers of the early black church. They tore his church down. It's now Spencer Square, and they put a statue there, Places like that were torn down. The theater, the main theater, the Hopkins, or at that time the National Theater. These were centers, of the community. And the people there had to go somewhere, And that's why I said it was basically an urban diaspora. They encroached into neighborhoods that were of different ethnic backgrounds, largely Polish or Italian or Irish, and Puerto Rican also, the Latin community. A lot of these sort of had to become integrated, by force, because these black people had to go somewhere, and it created a lot of tension in the city, which ultimately exploded in 1968. There were other things that were going on in the city too, like I-95 going right through the west side, and that was a different community then, but it still, created geopolitical walls within the city, and a lot of problems with people and other people, if you know what I'm saying. Mm. So it was a real blow to the city, and especially to the East Side, which was so rich in culture of all sorts, where the music scene in Delaware was really blossoming, in those early years.
So what kind of impact do you think all of that had in terms of the jazz community? And I know there's a jazz festival. I think it's the Clifford Brown Jazz Festival, I think it is. And there's a memorial scholarship, I think it was established at one point.
Right.
Has the jazz community recovered, or what has it changed? How would you describe it these days?
Well, again, I have to tip my hat to Boysie Lowry, because all during that time he was steadfast. He continued to have students there to keep, the music alive, to keep a lot of the ideas alive behind the music, because Boysie was a teacher, and he had a method, which was sought after, and his steadfastness really helped, along with the people who remembered people like Clifford Brown and Lem Winchester and Gerald Price, and who had studied with him, had worked with him, and they sort of kept on going and kept the jazz scene limping along throughout. And Clifford Brown's legacy was a big one, because one of the early events was an event that occurred just 20 years after he died in 1976. It was one of the earliest shows at the Grand Opera House in Wilmington, with some of his earliest musicians coming into play, a tribute to him, and that kind of launched the Clifford Brown Jazz Festival every summer. And there were a number of clubs, that tried to keep it alive. They were open for a while and closed for a period and stuff like that. The Boardroom in Wilmington was one of those who, kept the music alive in a city where people were afraid to visit, at night, things like that. So the jazz scene kept on going, and I guess basically on the strength of people like Clifford Brown and Lem Winchester, and those who stayed, like Millie Cannon, who was a jazz singer, and others. So yeah, it survived, and it's I think probably heading for a revival, but the times are changing,
Sure.
And there's different kinds of music out there.
That is certainly for sure. We were speaking with Stephen Leech. He's written a new book called Boysie's Horn, The History of Jazz in Wilmington in the 20th Century. And we do appreciate taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Oh, thank you so much, yes.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.